Good morning, Ridge family, whether you're here in person or online. Just so glad that you're here. Big happy Mother's Day to our mothers out there. Recognition that, you have biological mothers, but you also have adopted mothers. Many people in my life, women in my life who have been that for me, because the reality is, I recognized this recently, my mother and I, we've lived in separate countries for quite a long time, almost half of my life. And so I'm very, very grateful for those adopted moms who have come into my life for the last 20 years. And it made me actually think, as I was preparing for this sermon, how sweet it is when I'm able to get home. Despite the fact of living quite far apart, my parents actually still live in the humble house that I grew up in. And these houses are deceiving. They're almost like the Narnia wardrobe, small on the outside, big on the inside. They go like way back. And all the doors are under 6 feet. So if you think I have bad posture, that's probably why it is. They were just Irish people who were like that 100 years ago, I guess. But anyways, it's always really sweet going home because not only just getting to see my parents, but also Mom makes some of my favorite food from back there and has bought loads of candy or sweets, as we call them. So I just gorge myself on Cadbury's chocolate and all the rest of it. So it's really sweet homecoming. But this morning, I want us to think about another kind of homecoming. And this is one we find in Luke's gospel, and it's one of the stories of Jesus. And this is a story about a lost son. We might know it as the Prodigal Son, the story of the Prodigal Son. So whether this is something you're familiar with, maybe it's been a while since you have heard this story, or maybe this is new for you this morning. Let's watch this Bible Project video. We're going to get a quick recap of the story.
There was a father who had 2 sons.
The older son is trustworthy and honors his father.
And the younger son, he's a mess. He rebels and cashes in his inheritance to travel far away and blow it all on partying and being stupid.
And then there's a famine in the land, and he runs out of money. So he has to scrape by taking care of somebody's pigs. And he's so hungry he wants to eat the pig slop, at which point it occurs to him, if I'm gonna be a farmhand, I might as well go home and work for my dad. At least I won't be eating pig food. So he treks back home, rehearsing his apology.
Now, the father is certain that his son did not survive the famine. But then, one day, he sees someone walking down the road. It's his son. He's not dead. And so the father runs to him and embraces his son, kissing him all over.
The son starts his speech. Dad, I don't deserve to be your son. Maybe I could come and work for you.
But before he can finish, the father calls his servants to go get the nicest robe, new sandals, a fancy ring for his son. They are to prepare the best food for a banquet. It is time to celebrate.
Now later that day, the older brother arrives from a long day working in the field to discover his long-lost loser brother has come home, and they're celebrating?
And he gets angry. And think about it. He's been faithful to his father all of these years. He never got a party like this. And then this disgrace of a family member comes home, and they're going to celebrate him? It's disgusting. He refuses to join the banquet.
So the father finds the older brother outside, and he says,
Son, you are already in our family. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate your brother because he was lost. And now he's found. He was dead, but now he's alive.
So this story is one of a trilogy of stories that Jesus tells around a similar theme. And it's the theme of things that are lost being found. So the first story he tells is about a sheep that goes missing, and the shepherd goes out looking for the sheep, finds it, brings it home, and there's a celebration. The second story is a story about a woman with a very valuable coin that goes missing. And she looks everywhere for it, and she finds it. And then she celebrates with her neighbors. And so this is the third story of a similar story arc of something lost being found. Now, anytime you see anything in the Bible, it's either repeated twice or 3 times. It's best to kind of take note and recognition of it. It's why we sing holy, 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 3 times. There's a value in that, a worth in that. So I want us to jump into this story. Let's see what Jesus is teaching us here, because it turns out there's quite a lot. So looking at Luke 15, verse 11, we read, There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Now, this younger son, when his father died, would have got a third of the estate. That was due to him. It was part of custom. But the thing that we can't overlook here is the audacity of what the son is asking and what he means, what's behind it. But then also the restraint of the father in terms of his response. But let's think about the son for the moment. The son is asking something which essentially says to his father, Father, I don't really value you as a person. I don't really value our relationship so much as I just kind of value your stuff and what's coming to me. And in the most darkest of terms, essentially what the son was saying to the father was, I kind of rather you were dead, actually, by now, so that I could just have your stuff. So you kind of see how dark this is, but yet at the same time, the restraint of the father. What does the father say? The father says, yeah, he divides his property between the older and the younger son. Now just think about it a minute. How would you have responded in this scenario? Some of you are parents in this room, some aren't, but I think we can all have a pretty good idea of how we would respond. I can tell you what, I wouldn't have responded like the father did. I'd have been like, okay, son, let's go and have a conversation about this and what you're implying by asking this. That certainly didn't seem to be something out of like the kneeling it as a parent handbook. See, the son delivers an insult at a level that could have disqualified him from an inheritance, but instead, he receives it. The father does as he requests. So what is Jesus trying to tell us here? Well, I think what's important for us to know is that Jesus is not using this parable to teach parents how to deal with rebellious children. If you're looking for that in there, I don't think it's in there. But this is what I do think we learn. I think we learn something about God's willingness to on occasion permit damaging desires in our hearts, knowing the formative good that will result. Let me say that again. I think we learn something about God's willingness to on occasion permit damaging desires in our hearts, knowing the formative good that will result. Because think about it. The father could have taken the avenue that I think on face value would have what I would have done. Taken my son aside and said, look, okay, here's what's going to happen, right? If I give you your inheritance, you're going to squander it all on wild living. You're going to end up in a pig's pen somewhere. You're going to come home scruffy, dirty, and you're basically going to ask to be my servant. And I don't want that happening to you, so just don't. I'm going to say no. I feel like how I would have responded, and maybe you would have too, but the father doesn't. He permits what the son is asking for. Because the reality is, sometimes we have to experience the folly of our failures to truly experience change in our hearts. Sometimes there's no other way. Verse 13, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. So even before we get to that, actually, let's just stop for a moment. I often say to our young adults when we're going through chapters of the Bible, I'm just like, take your time as we're going through this. We're going through the book of 1 Samuel right now, and so many, there's a lot of stories in the Old Testament. So I say to them, I'm like, take your time and try and immerse yourself in the story. Try and put yourself in the story. So let's just try that here. Think about the father, and he brings the two sons to him. And I imagine maybe the elder son wasn't aware of what was going on. Anyway, the father says, okay, younger son has asked for the inheritance, and I'm going to divide it up between you. And I imagine the elder brother is like looking at his father like, what are you doing? Like, do you know your son? And yet the younger son, this is what I think he was thinking. He was feeling some sort of sense of suppressed excitement, I imagine. He was dreaming of all he was going to do with his inheritance. There was an anticipation at the prospect of what was ahead, this excitement. Not unlike what Pastor Mike shared last week. Rebellion can often feel good, at least initially. You know, it's no coincidence that rebellion is one of the most common themes in the Bible. It starts in Eden and goes to Abraham and Sarah and the Israelites, the early church, pretty much every century since. See, often there's things that can appeal to our godly longing for true love and a sense of worth and deep fulfillment and unique purpose. And yet when we pursue those things and created things, we end up with empty hands and empty hearts, just like the lost son. Reading from verse 14, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. He'd spent everything looking for those things, for joy and fulfillment and purpose and belonging. And verse 15, so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country. He also sent him to the fields to feed his pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And do you know what's ironic here? This young man is a Jew, and pigs were like unclean animals. I mean, they just stayed clear of them. And yet this young man finds himself not only broke and lonely, abandoned, but here he is with these pigs, you know. And not only that, he's so hungry, he wants to eat the food of the pigs. He has truly hit rock bottom. You see, the lost son thought that living a full life looked like living free from any sort of authority. Guys, we need to take that on board because it is something that the Bible yells at us from every page, is that the enemy will come alongside, and we will also think that really to live a full life, to live a life of freedom and fullness, is to live a life free from authority. And this is what the lost son thought. He thought that in fully expressing himself, that he might find himself and the fulfillment that he longed for. But instead of finding himself fulfilled, he found himself lost. And it all seems super heavy and, like, where's it going to go from here? But verse 17, we see a flicker of hope. Something begins to shift. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. I've shared on several occasions before, being very transparent to the fact that I am extremely directionally challenged. My wife has experienced this on a number of occasions. And we've lived in Ankeny for 3 years, in a few weeks, I guess. And I'm still using maps to get around certain areas of Ankeny, I confess. But this weakness did not serve me well when we lived close to Washington, D.C. I had to go into the city at least once a month. And I would go in for various events. Sometimes there were larger events happening there, sometimes presidential travel, whatever it might be. And they would start closing streets. And so much of Washington, D.C. is one way anyway. But they would close all these streets to the point that even sometimes your maps was getting confused. So that was no good. So here's the thing. I knew that if I could see the Washington Monument, if I could get to a place where I could see it, or I could drive past it in some sort of way, I could get my bearings again. It was in this place that I would recover my sense of direction, and then I could start going in the right way. I knew where I was heading. Here's the thing. In life, sometimes, I think it takes for us to get to a particular place to get our bearings again, to see things clearly. Sometimes it's going through pain and hardship. For others, they really have to hit rock bottom. Maybe for some of you, that's been your story. But whatever it is, and it was certainly for the lost son, it's there that we come to our senses. We recover our directional sense. We start heading in the right way again toward the Father, whereas before we'd been completely lost. And it's amazing to see how this valley experience was a turning point for this young man. That God used his rebellion to spark a revival in his heart. Because you remember what he was like at the beginning? You know, the audacity of the ask. He was so selfish to the point of just not even realizing how hurtful he was being, prideful. All he wanted was his father's stuff. And as long as he had that in his heart, reconciliation was never possible with his father. Relationship was never possible with his father. And yet, in verse 17, we see the polar opposite. He's humble. He's respectful. He sees himself and his actions with clarity. And because he now approaches his father with humility and sincerity, reconciliation is possible. Relationship is possible. And you might say, well, it's a great story. I mean, but what does that really have to do with us? Well, it turns out it has everything to do with us. See, Jesus didn't ask us to approach God with all our religious ducks in a row. Part of the people who are listening to this story are the Pharisees. The people who felt like they had all the religious ducks in a row, that they did this and this and this and this and this, then essentially God would be in debt to them, and they would just cash in all their religiosity and walk into heaven. And yet Jesus says things like this: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He says, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is teaching us that when being in relationship with God begins and continues from a place of humility, we come to God like the prodigal son. Father, I've sinned against you. I'm not worthy to be your daughter, your son. I need the forgiveness Jesus has won for me. Do you see, it's that posture of the heart that makes reconciliation with God possible. And so how does the father respond? Verse 20. So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran. He ran to his son. And he threw his arms around him and he kissed him. Jesus is painting a most beautiful picture of the Father, God the Father here. I can't tell you how many times this has really spoken to me. In fact, it reminds me of a sculpture, one of my favorite sculptures by a guy called Charlie Mackesy. And this is the sculpture of the Prodigal Son. And it's always really struck me because with the father wrapping his arms tightly around his son, and yet the arms of the son just lifeless, squandered everything, nothing left to give. And then you see the earnest expression of the father embracing the son. Because, listen, I don't know about you, but in the past I have not had this picture of God in my head. I know in the past for me, sometimes it's been a sense of God kind of having his arms crossed, like not terribly happy with me, not like super happy, or, just kind of in the middle, like meh. Or sometimes it's maybe you feel like God loves you, but it's a very general sense, Not in the sense that we get here where the Father runs to the Son and he embraces him. The kind of father that ushers you to you and puts him on your lap and holds you. And yet this is what we see depicted here. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. Here's the question, though. How is he worthy of such a homecoming? Did you feel a bit of that with the elder brother, He's He's painted as kind of like a villain, but you're like, yeah, right. If that was my younger brother, I would say exactly the same thing, you know? How is he worthy of such a homecoming? Well, how are we worthy of such a homecoming? Coming home into the arms of our Heavenly Father. Well, it turns out that the prodigal son was right. He wasn't worthy to be called a son. He speaks for all of us in that. And yet the Father embraced the Son, not because he deserved it, but because of his mercy and his grace. It was the Father's mercy and grace that made that embrace possible. Because it's easy to forget, you know, we think, well, this is a wonderful moment. The son has come home. There's celebration. But you forget that a third of the Father's property, investments, whatever, is gone. You know, that damage is done. And it's a price that his son could never repay. But the Father took the hit for the Son. He absorbed the cost himself, and he welcomed his Son home. And you know what? I could get up here and I could say to you guys, you know, come home to the Father. Come home to the Father. And you'd say to me, Will, I can't come home. I know my heart. I know what's in my past. I know my potential in the future. I can't come home. And here's the thing. When we come to God, it's not that God kind of brushes all that under the rug. No, he takes it upon himself. Jesus took all of that upon himself. It's Jesus who absorbed that cost for us and makes a heavenly homecoming possible. Isn't that wonderful? Jesus was primarily saying this to the Pharisees. That's what they needed to hear. Stop with all this religiosity stuff and thinking that you're going to enter into relationship with God through this and receive this free gift. That's good news for us. So coming into close, what I find interesting, one of the things I find interesting about this story is the title of the story. It's called The Lost Son. But it seems to me that there's definitely two sons here, two sons that are equally lost. Because the younger brother, he comes home, or the older brother comes home, remember? And there's the celebration for the younger brother. And the older brother became angry and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. And he answered his father, "Look." He doesn't even call him his father. He just says, "Look, you." That's the kind of implied. "All these years I've been slaving for you and you never disobeyed your orders. And yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours," doesn't call him his brother, "this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes come home, you kill the fattened calf for him." So here's what we learn. Despite the elder son's close physical proximity with his father, after all, he stayed home and he was out in the fields. But what we learn is he's just as far away from his dad as his younger brother. And the clue we have is in the phrase, "All these years I've been slaving for you." Because on the outside, you look at it and you think, wow, like he's been faithful all these years, you know, going out. And who knows what the younger brother was doing. I'm sure this wasn't the first kind of rebellious thought that he'd had. And yet this brother, this older brother, he's been faithful to the father, getting up and working hard and all of those things, seemingly on the outside, doing all the right things. And yet what we realize is that the root of all of that was actually a selfish ambition. The elder brother was using all these things as a means to earn and therefore deserve the father's acceptance and love. He was working for the relationship, you see. That makes total sense then when he comes home and he sees this younger brother who's done absolutely nothing and has insulted his father, and he says, What? Like, what has he done to deserve any of this? You know, look at me. I I've been slaving away all these years. It suddenly all comes out, you see. I've not just been working for you and working on your property. I've been slaving away for you like all these years, and you've done nothing for me. You owe me, is essentially what he's saying. But the father responds and he says, my son. The father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. In other words, son, you didn't need to work for this relationship. You can't earn it. You can only receive it as a gift. And you know what the sad thing is? I feel like so many people can spend so much time of their life trying to earn their relationship with God. On the outside, looking in, somebody might see that you are faithful in attending church, and you're faithful in meeting with your community group, and you're faithful in showing up for serving events. And guys, all those things are helpful and good. But I think my question for you this morning is, what's motivating you? What's motivating you? That was the question for the elder brother. Are you doing it all out of a gratitude for a relationship that you have received as a free gift? Or are you trying to use those things as a means to gain that relationship, gain eternity? That's where the elder brother stood, and sadly he then became angry and prideful and dismissing of others who God was showing grace toward. See, this story fundamentally is about grace. It's about grace. That was the homecoming. It wasn't just that the prodigal son returned home physically. That was worth celebrating. He wasn't dead. Great. But his heart was changed. His heart was changed, and he received the embrace of his father. He embraced the mercy and the grace of his father. So maybe this morning you're listening to this and you feel like you can't really relate to the lost son in the story, but maybe you relate to the elder brother. I want to just say to you, if you have that sense inside of you that maybe I am trying to earn my way with God. Maybe I am depending on all these things that I'm doing, that he's going to accept me and love me and embrace me like this. If that's you, I encourage you, stop trying to earn what Jesus died and rose again to give you freely. So the lost son is in fact a story of two sons, both equally lost, both equally in need of their father's grace. Let's pray together.